Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. So you just heard that tagline for my podcast where I say that I celebrate unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscover forgotten stories that change our world. So one of the things that I'm trying to do with this podcast is something that a lot of history podcasters do, and that's do revisionist history. What that means is that you're trying to look at history from a different perspective than it's usually looked at. If you do military history, you're usually looking at things from the perspective of a general. If you're doing political history, you're usually looking at things from the perspective of a president or prime minister, just looking at the big picture. In this episode, we're really going to do revisionist history because we're going to look at history through the perspective of illegal drugs, specifically through the perspective of marijuana. Now, this isn't as gonzo of an idea as you might think. In my days as an Ottoman historian, I knew someone doing his thesis on opium smuggling in Interwar Turkey and Beyond. And the Opium Wars, and the massive trade in opium between South Asia and China in the 19th century, had a huge role in the history of colonialism and globalization. Today specifically, I'm talking with David Bienestock about how hashish arrived in Europe via the Napoleonic invasions. In 1798, Napoleon invaded Egypt in a failed attempt to install colonial rule. French soldiers succeeded in adopting the local custom of consuming hashish, a practice with a long history in the Islamic world, and I can back that up. But when the French occupation ended, French soldiers brought a taste for cannabis home that led directly to the formation of Paris's famed Club des Hashischins. This is where Alexandre Dumas, Victor Hugo, Honoré de Balzac, and Charles Baudelaire drank coffee laced with marijuana. This is going to be one of my more unconventional episodes. I met David at a history podcasters meetup at the Podcast Movement Conference. David is the host of the Great Moments in Weed History podcast. He was a head of content at High Times Magazine, and he's been a columnist and contributor to Vice, GQ, The Guardian, and other publications. And he's also a marijuana activist. So based on that description, if you don't think this episode will be your cup of tea and you're more interested in my more straightforward episodes like World War II history, no problem. You're more than welcome to check those out. But I really recommend sticking around because I had a blast talking with David about these things and feel like I'm living up to my mission to look at history through perspectives that it's not normally seen. And hallucinogens have been with humanity since recorded history. It's been a part of innumerable religious rituals and traditions. And we get into that long history in this episode, but focus on the French occupation of Egypt, how marijuana enters Europe, how it eventually comes to the United States, that whole through line, to give an explanation of why marijuana is illegal today from a historical background. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion with David Bienestock. David, welcome to the show.
Oh, my pleasure.
Your podcast topic, I'm pretty excited about this because this is probably going to be one of the most interesting episodes on my show so far because I've gone over some interesting and important but pretty well-tread ground like Pickett's Charge and the Battle of Gettysburg or discussing America's rationale for dropping the atomic bomb in World War II. But we got to look at the history of humanity through the perspective of marijuana. So, and that's a great thing about podcasting. This probably wouldn't be a course listed in a traditional university's history faculty or history curriculum. How did you decide to start this podcast? I guess that's a good starting point.
Well, let me start by saying any deans of history departments that are pretty cool and hip and looking for... I'm ready to go academic under the right circumstances. So shout out weed smoking history deans. But yeah, you know, my background is in journalism. I've been writing about cannabis for about 15 years. I started out at High Times. I've written for Vice. I write for a place now called Leafly. So this has been a long-term, subject for me. I'm also a cannabis consumer. I'm a member of the community. It's something I believe in strongly. I consider myself sort of an advocate journalist, which is also a long and I think proud tradition. And I happen to be pretty sure that I've been on the right side of history with the cannabis issue. Things have changed a lot in the 15 years I've been doing this. And so now coming into this new era, I started the podcast with my partner, Abdullah Saeed, who we worked together on a Vice television show called Bong Appetit. And we've both been longtime journalists and media makers around cannabis. And so, working on this show together, there was just tons of downtime. And we would generally spend it smoking weed and telling each other stories and making each other laugh. And when, about a year ago, we found ourselves, I had left High Times, he had left Vice. We really wanted to do something together independently. We were really attracted to podcasting as a form where we could have complete creative control. And we honestly tried out a bunch of different ideas for a show, and the history format just really clicked for us. We're both into history in general. And I think sort of more importantly, as things change so much with legalization, we both really fear that the actual true grassroots underground resistance, outlaw history of cannabis and how it came to be legalized is going to be sort of greenwashed away as corporate interests move in, as this becomes more, for want of a better word, mainstream. This idea that people pushed back against this terrible, oppressive governmental program to arrest people and to disrupt minority communities and to, go after dissidents and all these terrible things are going to be ignored and swept under the rug in favor of stories about all the money to be made now that it's legal. So, this culture has its own heroes. We have our own, on the one hand, it's a story of oppression, and on the other hand, it's a story about resistance and ultimately overcoming and subverting that prohibition system. So, there's a lot to explore. At the same time, we have a lot of fun with it, and laugh as much as we learn, I guess.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this topic because I think for almost everyone, the way they'd understand weed in America is through the war on drugs, unless they're coming at it from a different place, like activism or whatever. But I'm sure it was viewed very differently in the past because, like you've discussed and what we're going to discuss, it's been with humanity since the very beginning. So different cultures will understand it in different ways. So what was that perspective and how did it change over time? And even before I was getting ready to record and called you up, I Googled the legalization of marijuana in Iowa, just because that's where I'm from. And I wrote a book about Iowa called How Iowa Conquered the World. There's a book that will just burn up the bestseller charts on Iowan history. People can't get enough of that. But something about that is that in World War II, it was a huge industrial producer of industrial hemp for things like textiles and rope and everything else. And just in August, I think the Iowa Senate approved what they called the Iowa Industrial Hemp Act to re-legalize it, at least industrially, to produce in Iowa. So there you go, from World War II back to today. And this is just one aspect of it. So I guess the starting point is 10,000 years ago. So you mentioned, I think somewhere in the description of your show, that humanity's history with marijuana goes back 10,000 years. Used medicinally or smoked, has that been going on for thousands of years, or is this something more in modern history, or where does it all start?
Yeah, well, when we go back 10,000 years, that's give or take a year or two.
Of course, exactly.
But that's the earliest signs we have of it. That's the dawn of agriculture in general. And I believe that that's no coincidence, and no less a personage than Carl Sagan, who we did a whole episode about, and who was an enthusiastic, albeit closeted, cannabis consumer throughout his life. In one of his books, he speculated that cannabis may have been the first ever cultivated plant. So, of course, in foraging societies that predate agriculture, you have people identifying useful plants, gathering them, even, sort of moving to where they know they are. But the next step from there to cultivating, to agriculture, that's about 10,000 years ago. Carl Sagan speculated that cannabis may have been the plant that inspired that. I certainly think that makes a lot of sense when you have a plant that can provide food, that can also provide medicine, that can provide, industrial uses, can be made into clothing, can be made into all these other useful products. That makes a lot of sense. And so that transition, of course, for humanity is a bit of a mixed bag. That's sort of a whole other topic. I really love a book called Sex at Dawn that really talks about what life was like in these foraging societies and how it might have been a much better deal than we've been led to believe. But one of the good things we got out of agriculture is a steadier supply of weed. So that, that's one for the plus column. And from there, the vast majority of our experience with cannabis as human beings is that this plant is considered special and revered and useful, whether that's hemp, ropes, and sails powering the age of exploration, which is also, of course, a very mixed bag. Depend on if you are doing the exploring or the one being explored. But that aside, a big thing to put aside, or whether it is as a medicinal plant. We have records going back in China, like to 5,000 or 6,000 BC, maybe. I don't have all my. I should say I'm a historian only through doing this show. I'm learning. I do put a lot. I'm a trained journalist. I've been doing that for 15 years. I know how to research a story. I promise you, if you check out the show from a history perspective, you will get real history. But I'm not a real historian. So, but the medicinal use goes back, 5,000-6,000 years BC. It's documented in China. That's a long tradition. It's only a blip in history, this prohibition. And as you say, we, with good reason, but we often focus on that when we look at this subject, whether it's prohibition and what's wrong with it, or moving out of prohibition, but we don't always take the long 10,000-year perspective.
And in terms of ancient societies, I guess that'd be difficult to lock down because you have marijuana that it's not going to be in archaeology remains. So I'm just trying to think, what evidence?
It actually...
Oh, or does it?
It actually is.
Oh, really?
We've found, there's been archaeological finds with seeds. There was a ancient shaman in Siberia who had they had figured out some way to sort of protect the actual plant matter, and it was tested, and it was found to be, still psychoactive. Even I should look that one up to get the date.
Yeah, it's something I should check out in terms of like an archaeology site, especially something that has to do with a religious ritual where you'd have the shaman and that kind of thing going on. So I went to an archaeology site in Turkey that is one of the oldest archaeology sites that has been discovered, called Göbekli Tepe. It dates back 9,000 or 10,000 years. This is before the oldest human settlement has been found. So it's a religious worship site that was something that hunter-gatherers would go to before there'd even be cities around. So the structures, they look like humans that are very huge and block-shaped. That I should ask someone if there'd be evidence of marijuana found there. But the humans, at least, they look like something out of Pink Floyd cover art, or who's that guy from the Talking Heads who wore those enormous suits?
David Byrne.
There it is. Yeah. So it kind of looks like that. So if that's a tie-in at all, then not very good evidence, but it's what I have to go off of. So there you go. Yeah. So what we're going to talk about, and something that you focused on specifically in an episode, is one of the main ways that marijuana enters Europe.